back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series within VMware. More specifically, we're continuing on in the VMware Certified Professional version 6. Joining me back in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back into the world of vSphere 6. And in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at single sign-on. And it is important that we have a good understanding of what VMware means when they say single sign-on, because it's a little bit different than what other people might be thinking. When we talk about single sign-on, there's actually two different levels of authentication that happen inside of VMware, inside of vSphere. There's authentication between the different components in vSphere and communication between vSphere and external components. So for example, when I think of single sign-on, I always think of two completely different environments. So for example, VMware vSphere on one side and Microsoft Active Directory on another, right? Two completely different companies, two completely different user databases, and yet we get them to talk together. Now I have one user account that I can use in both environments, right? To me, that's what I think of when I think of single sign-on. But VMware extends that to go a little bit beyond two completely different systems to include their own systems. In other words, if I have two ESXi hosts, how can I make it where I have one user account that I can log into both of those ESXi hosts with? Or if I have more than one vCenter server, or if I have an entire infrastructure in place, how do I log into all of my VMware components with just one account? And that's considered single sign-on also. Even though it's all within the VMware umbrella of products, it's still single sign-on. So regardless of whether we integrate with some third-party system, when you install vSphere 6, you are creating a single sign-on environment. So everybody, 100% of the, not ESX, but of the VMware users are using a single sign-on environment. But it may just be set up automatically for you and you never notice it. So you ignore it, you don't even pay attention to the term. Unfortunately, if you're going to take the exam, that's not really an option, right? So we do need to know about it, and we do need to know how to integrate to external hosts. So before I dive into the external host part, though, let's just talk a little bit about what we have by default. When we installed vSphere, or when we installed vCenter in particular, if you watched our episode on the installing vCenter, you saw that when I went through the installation, there came a part where it asked a couple of questions that had to deal with single sign-on. But it didn't come right out and call them single sign-on. What it was talking about was something called the Platform Services Controller, the PSC. When you install vCenter, there's really two components. There's the vCenter server itself, which we use to manage our VMs, and then there's the PSC, the Platform Services Controller. And in that Platform Services Controller there's 4 or 5 different components, but the two that we really care about are the VMCA and the single sign-on functionality. All right, single sign-on, or SSO, that's just sharing a user account, making it where I can have one user account that works in multiple locations, right? That's what single sign-on provides. It provides a way for two systems to communicate and figure out if a user account is valid. The VMCA, that's the Virtual Machine Certificate Authority. It's a certificate service for providing certificates for authentication. Now, when we authenticate, we usually authenticate with a username and a password, right? That's probably the most common way of authenticating. But we can authenticate with certificates also. Single sign-on is built around users and passwords for the most part. VMCA is what provides certificate services. And so for anything that uses certificates, the VMCA gets involved. And that's a part of the PSC. I'm going to see how many acronyms I can use in this episode. So the Platform Services Controller is providing single sign-on and certificate authority services. And that really is set up for us. When we run through that installer and we tell it, all we picked was, do we want an external PSC or an embedded PSC? Embedded meant that the PSC would be installed right on the same box as our vCenter server. And external means that I would have one PSC box and one vCenter box, right? Two separate machines. The vCenter box is providing all my management. The PSC box is providing single sign-on and a certificate authority. Now, if I have more than one vCenter server, they can all share one PSC. So now I've got one certificate authority and single sign-on box that's servicing all of my vCenter boxes, and in turn, all the ESX hosts that are attached to it and all the data centers, data stores, and all the other stuff that's a part of that environment, all tied into one single sign-on environment. So that's where we start talking about authenticating between VMware devices, is that I might have a user account in vCenter, but I can log into ESX using that vCenter account. Or I can log into the PSC using that vCenter account, because the vCenter account actually exists in the PSC. So that's the functionality that we get by default. And during the install, we just clicked next a bunch of times, and it built that infrastructure for us. All right. So if you ever want to see the components, you see it in action, it's kind of spread out in a few different places. So let me show you here. I'll take this this installation that I've got, and I did a simple install on this, right? So it is the vCenter server and PSC running on the same box. This is an embedded installation. And we can go into vCenter, and if we want to see things like the certificate authority, right, the CA is actually buried kind of deep into this. If we go under administration, and inside of administration, we can go down to system configuration, and inside of system configuration, way down here under deployment, we can go to nodes, and we'll start to see our nodes, right? And so here's my vCenter server. And this node, if I had a separate PSC, it would show up under here too, right? I did embedded, so I just have one box. That's my vCenter server and my PSC. If I did them separate, I'd see both. I'd see my vCenter server and the PSC listed separately. So for the certificates, I'd want to make sure I clicked whichever one had my PSC. And once I choose that, I can go to Manage, and now you can see the certificate authority right there. And so it's going to load up. Now, a couple of words about this. When I pull this up, you're going to see where it says we have to verify our password. Certificates are very sensitive. If somebody compromises our certificate database, that's a bad thing, right? And we'd have to invalidate all our certificates. So in order to work with this, we have to verify the password. And I don't know if it's a quirk with the user interface or a bug with the web client or whatever, but it is astronomically slow. It is really, really slow. So when I provide my password and tell it OK, it's going to verify my password. And if I look down here under my recent task, here we go, starting the task. This is starting to authenticate me against the certificate server. It will work. It will get me in, I promise you. But it takes like 2 minutes sometimes. And a lot of times the web server will time out, so you end up having to refresh your page. And we've got that refresh icon right up here at the top that we can use refresh to get into it. So if you're going to use the web UI to interact with the certificate authority, you can. Just be ready for it. It's really slow, and it's been like this in every environment I've worked on, not just this environment here on the show, but in every one I've actually ever touched. So for me, I don't normally work with the certificate authority via the web UI. I typically use the command line interface for it, and we're going to see that in the hardening episode. We'll get into that, and I'll show you the command line interface there. But what I really wanted to show you here for this episode was just that this is the certificate authority, that we've got it right here because this is my PSC. And so it's providing certificate services. And every ESXi host that I bring into this vCenter deployment will trust this CA, which means they'll allow this CA to issue certificates to them, and now I've got trusted certificates between them. All right. Now, we don't normally ever have to do anything in here. It just kind of sits here. But the number one thing that we may want to configure is instead of having vCenter be a certificate authority, we can make it an issuer, a secondary. In the world of PKI, public key infrastructure, you have your root CA, and then you have your secondary CAs, the ones that are sometimes they're called intermediary CAs. They're the ones that are issuing certificates, but they're not actually the root. We might already have a root. If I've got a Microsoft Active Directory, I've probably deployed a certificate authority as a part of that. And so if I've already got a CA, I might want to keep that. And so what you can do is you can go in here and you can ditch your own CA, the one in VMware, and make yourself an issuer off of your Microsoft CA. So now you keep the standard CA you're already using through your entire environment, and VMware fits into that nicely. That's not so much single sign-on as it is public key infrastructure, but it kind of goes hand in hand, right? It is a form of authentication, and we can play nice with other providers that are out there. So that's usually what we would configure here. But if you're kind of watching my screen, you'll see it's still sitting there, still starting the test, still 0%. I promise you, it will finish. It literally takes 2 minutes or more to do this. Actually, I feel like it's been more than 2 minutes already, so it may have just timed out. But the web service will eventually time out, and you refresh and you get in. So I normally ditch out of this and go to the CLI. We'll see that in the hardening episode. All right, so that's one piece of the single sign-on infrastructure. But that's kind of a minor piece because we don't normally have to mess with it. If you don't have an existing public key infrastructure, then you just ride with what VMware gives you by default, and it works fine. It's great. You get in there and you're done, right? But the user accounts, the authentication, that's something that we will have to mess with. And so that's another piece that's handled by our PSC. And so if I want to get in and work with that, we have to go to a different place, okay? And what we do is we go back to, I'm just going to jump right back to the home page. And under home, I'm going to go to administration, right? So I'm going to jump back to administration. And inside of administration, I'm going to go into our configuration for single sign-on. So see how you've got administration, and then right under that we've got single sign-on, and here's the configuration for single sign-on. Now, when we look at that configuration, we're going to see a few things. The default thing that pops up is the password policy, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But where I want to start is this guy right here, identity sources. These are the places that I've already got single sign-on configured for. So when I log in with a user account, where can those user accounts come from? When I assign a role to a group, where can those groups come from? So these are sources for users and groups. And there's 2 by default. You'll have this on any vCenter deployment. You'll always have 2 by default. The first one is vSphere.local. Well, during the install, if you accepted all the defaults, then it'll be vSphere.local. But if you put in your own domain name during the install, it'll be your domain name here. So whatever domain name you've attached to vCenter, that's what's going to show up here. And that's the main vSphere repository for user accounts. So that's the one that we normally work with. This is the one I've been using this whole series so far, is vSphere.local, or whatever name you gave it. But after that, you'll see another one, and notice the type here, local OS. All right. This vCenter server is running on top of Windows, and Windows has users and groups right there on the local machine, and that's what this is referring to. So my server is called plabvc01, and you'll see that it is a local OS account here. It's a Windows account. It's got its own users and passwords. So we're already set up for that. We've already got single sign-on between vSphere and this instance of Windows. But where things get really fun is when we add external sources, when we add other people that we can connect to. And when we add external sources, now we can have some real fun. Right now we can connect to things like the Active Directory, and all of our user accounts and groups that we've already got for supporting Windows will be visible here. And that's not the only one. You can add all sorts of different ones. If I hit the little green plus sign here, we'll see the different ones that are supported. Notice that Active Directory is listed twice. First, it's Active Directory Integrated Windows Authentication. Okay. The second one is Active Directory as an LDAP server. Microsoft's Active Directory, it technically runs the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, LDAP. But Microsoft has kind of messed around with it a bit on the back end. And so it's not a perfect implementation of LDAP. It's not completely standards compliant. So we can authenticate against it using Active Directory's authentication and providing usernames and passwords for Active Directory in our standard Windows authentication. Or we can connect via LDAP. And what you're going to notice, the big difference, is the information that I have to provide down here. If I do Active Directory, see how the only thing I have to provide technically is the domain name, and that's it. But I could also provide some additional data here, like a username and a password to connect. But when I go with LDAP, true LDAP, I have to provide a lot more. I've got to provide where the user accounts are stored, where the groups are stored, the primary URLs for connecting, and so on, because the official standard allows for those to change, allows for those to be different values. Microsoft has chosen a different value, and by choosing the integrated one, it's already going to know those values and it'll point right to them. So we've got 2 different ways of getting connected. But you also have OpenLDAP. And OpenLDAP is really cool because if you have an entire Unix or Linux environment, you can fire up an OpenLDAP server, and now you can do single sign-on with your Unix boxes and VMware. You can also do OpenLDAP against things like Apple's Open Directory, Novell's eDirectory. You can even tie it into things like Shibboleth. And Shibboleth, if you've never worked with that, it's an open source identity management framework that allows you to connect to darn near anything. So once you have vSphere connected to this, now you can authenticate with stinking Twitter accounts or Facebook or whatever. You can go nuts with it, right? So OpenLDAP really opens up the door to be able to authenticate to darn near anything. And then you've got local OS. Now, I don't really need local OS because I've already got local OS set up on this machine, right? Well, what it's referring to are the other machines that I might have inside of vSphere. If I have my PSC running on one machine and my vCenter running on another, the local OS by default is going to be the PSC's OS. What if I want to use local accounts from the vCenter server too? I could come in and I could add that as a valid local source, and now I'd be able to authenticate against those accounts also. So you have a little bit of flexibility how you want to do that. I don't think I've ever actually done this in production because there's not really a whole lot of point. We're normally tying to some kind of external directory, right? Like the Microsoft Active Directory. Which, you know, talking about it's one thing, seeing it in action is another. Let's kind of look at how this works. I'm going to just cancel out of this one if it'll let me. And oh, my window's kind of trimming off the bottom. I can't see the cancel button. It's going to force me to configure it, isn't it? Those mean guys always making me configure stuff. There we go. Now I can cancel it. All right, so I'm going to cancel out of that. And we've got local OS already set up. So what is local OS? Well, this is a Windows box. And in Windows, I've got user accounts, right? So if I go into my server manager, and inside of my server manager, I can go to Tools and Computer Management. And in Computer Management, I can go to Local Users and Groups and Users. And here I see Administrator and Guest. And under Groups, I see, well, there's a bunch of groups here, right? So I could come in and I could create an account, and it would be here in Windows. I could use it for Windows permissions, all the Windows stuff that I want to use. I could use it to log into this Windows machine. And vCenter is going to see it because single sign-on is already configured, right? So I'm going to come in and I'll add an account, and let's see, who can we make an account for? Let's go Star Trek today. So I'm going to create an account for B Cisco, and I think I'm spelling that wrong. Benjamin. Do you remember how Cisco spelled his name? I think it was like that. So anyhow, so we'll do one for Benjamin Cisco. I'm going to create him an account, and he's just going to be a local Windows user, right? So this isn't in vSphere. This is just right here, local Windows, and getting that one created. And maybe I'll create a group, which I'll just call local, not Starship, but I'll call them local captains. Actually, he wasn't a captain. Well, we won't get into our Star Trek nuances here. So we'll create a group called Star Trek Captains. I'm going to throw in Benjamin Cisco. So let me just get his account pulled up here, and we'll find him. Or if we just did B Cisco for his account, should find that easy enough. There we go. And so I'm going to get him thrown in the group. I'll create that. So now I've created a local group and a local user account right here inside of Windows, right? Not messing with VMware at all. But because VMware is already configured for single sign-on with the local OS, those will show up and I can start using them. So if I were to jump back here, I'm not going to see anything different here. And in fact, under single sign-on, if I go down to users and groups, I don't see anything different here either, right? I'm looking at users and I don't see Benjamin Cisco. And if I look at groups, I don't see my local captains. Well, the reason I'm not seeing them is that by default, what you're seeing is vSphere.local. Right? And if I drop that down, I can choose PLAB VC01, and now I'm seeing the Windows accounts, and there's Benjamin Cisco right there. So VMware, without me configuring anything, already recognizes those local accounts. Thing is, who really uses local Windows accounts? If this were a server in a DMZ, maybe, right? Maybe then we would do it because we don't want to connect it back to our Active Directory. But if this is any kind of internal server, it's going to be joined to an Active Directory, to a domain. And we want to use domain accounts. Local accounts only work on this one server. If I have 1,000 servers, I want it to work on all of them, right? And that's where a directory comes in. So I want to connect this to my Active Directory. And now I'll get access to all the various accounts that are in the Active Directory. Now, technically, this machine is a domain member. So this Windows machine, it's running Windows Server 2012, and it is connected to a domain. It's connected to, I believe it's called practicelabs.com. So let's find out here. We'll verify that. So I'm going to pull up the properties on this PC, and we'll see that, yeah, sure enough, right here I can see the computer name is PLAB VC01, and I'm joined to a domain called practicelabs.com. So my server that vCenter is running on is joined to an Active Directory domain. But single sign-on is not set up for that automatically. For the local accounts it is, for domain accounts it's not. Even if you're a domain member, it's not. And I know what you might be thinking, well, what if I'm a domain controller? Well, you're not allowed to install vCenter on a domain controller, well, unless you do it. So that'll never happen. But on a domain member, you can install it. It just doesn't set up single sign-on. So we need to set that up. Okay, and setting it up is not hard. If I go back into my client and I go back down to my single sign-on configuration, we can take a look at our sources, right? So I've already got the source for local OS and for the vSphere.local, and I can add a new source. I'm going to choose Active Directory, all right? And I'll use the integrated Windows authentication because I don't need to change anything. It's the standard Microsoft install. What's going to be different, though, is right down here, I need to pick who I'm going to connect as. And you've got two choices. If your machine is joined to the domain, you can just choose to use the machine account. It'll connect to the Active Directory using the machine account, everything will work fine, and that's it. That's usually the best way to go. Machine accounts are really neat because their passwords are super complex and they change very, very often. Sometimes as often as every 6 hours, but at a minimum they change according to whatever your password policy is, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't even know what your machine account's password is. So it's kind of like an extra level of security. It's handling all that for you. So the machine account's the way to go if your vCenter server is joined to the domain. But what if your vCenter server is not joined to the domain? What if it is a Windows box and I just didn't join it to the domain? Or what if I use the vCenter appliance and it's running SUSE Linux under the hood? It's not going to be joined to the domain there either, right? And so in that case, I'm going to have to use a dedicated user account and password. And so here you specify a server principal name, an SPN. So what server am I going to be connecting to? A username and a password. And you've got to provide credentials because you're not already logged in. But because I'm a domain member, I can just choose use a machine account. Otherwise, I would put in here some kind of account that I use specifically for this purpose. Don't use a user account. You'll think like, I'll just put my credentials in there, it'll be fine. It will, it'll be fine. Right up until the point where you change your password. And now you can't log into vCenter anymore, right? Because now it can't see the Active Directory. So you want to make sure it's a dedicated account just used for vCenter and that you manage its password appropriately. You do need to change the password from time to time, because the older the password gets, the more likely it can be brute forced. All right, but I'll be able to use a machine account, and that's going to make this super easy. I mean, really, at this point, I just need to click OK, if I can get the OK button to show up on my screen. You know, the lower your resolution is, the harder it becomes to see some of these things. There we go. And so I'll just hit the OK button, and that's going to add it in. So now that it's got to add it in, I can see that I've got practicelabs.com. It's an Active Directory account, and I'm attached to it. So now when I start to go to work with user accounts and work with groups, it'll know in the background it can reach out and talk to the Active Directory and see that system. Now, I don't see it here. Let's go over to users and groups. And when I go to users and groups, right now I see vSphere.local. That's my default. If I drop that down, now I've got practicelabs.com, and I can choose that and look at all the user accounts that just appeared. These are all my Active Directory user accounts. There's a John Smith, a Jan Regas, Elizabeth Scott, Lisa Way something or another. So I've got these user accounts turning up. These are all in my Active Directory. And it's not just user accounts, the groups turn up also. So now I can use my standard Active Directory accounts, and I've got single sign-on capabilities. If I take one of these users, like John, and I put him in a group and assign him the role of administrator inside of VMware, inside of vCenter, now he can log into vCenter with his domain account, right? And that's really going to make this kind of a much easier environment. So now I've got my standard Windows account that I log into my desktop with, I log into my email with, and now when I go to manage vCenter, I log in with the same account. All right, now what's the big benefit of that? The biggest benefit is I only have to remember one password, right? The password for my Windows account, and that's it, my Active Directory account. The other thing is if I ever need to change my password, I can go change my password in Active Directory, and now it's changed on my local computer, it's changed on my email, and it's changed in vCenter when I go to log in, because all of them actually exist in the same place, in the Active Directory. I have one username and password, single sign-on. I sign in with the same account in each of these different places, and I don't have to worry about doing all these different types of passwords and remembering different places to go to reset the password when I decide to change, and so on. It's all kind of in one place. That's the big advantage we have there. But now I do need to remember when we start assigning permissions, right? So if I go, let me go back to the home, and I'll go into my host and clusters. When I start to assign permissions to something, so you know, maybe I take this London data center. In the London data center, I can go to manage it. I can go to the permissions right here, and I can start to assign permissions. And so when I add some new permissions in here, on the left side I'm seeing users and groups, right? People that I can add in, and I can give them a role. Maybe I want to make my domain admins an administrator on this system, right? So I can come down here and I can hit add, and now here's the part I have to remember is that when I'm picking, I've got to remember to choose my source up top. Right? And it's showing practicelabs.com. It's showing that domain because that's the most recent one I added. So it's assuming that's the one that I want. But I can start to pick and choose. And notice, oh, actually, it's not showing my domain. That's the local machine, plab vc01, because I see Benjamin Sisko, right? That's my first hint. This is my local machine. So this is the Windows local account. And so I can add that one in. And so I'm adding Benjamin Sisko. I can then switch that to the domain. The domain was called Practice Labs. And now I can add in Elizabeth Scott or administrator. These are users. I can go down and find the group. I'm going to find the domain admins group. I say I'm going to find it. It is in here somewhere. Domain admins, right there. I'm going to add domain administrators, okay? And I can go in and I can add in something from vsphere.local. So maybe I want to add in the administrators or some other account that I've created here. I guess I really haven't created any accounts, have I? Yeah, so that's going to limit my utility there, but I'll just add administrator. All right, so when you look at what I'm doing down here, I'm adding user accounts and groups from 3 different sources all at the same time. So I've got to remember in my mind when I start assigning permissions to make sure I'm connecting to the right source. And when I connect to the right source, then I can assign those permissions and assign them how we want. So I can make Benjamin Cisco an administrator. That's that local Windows account. I can make my vSphere administrator group administrators, and I can make my domain admins administrators, or whatever other role it is I want to assign to them. And you can always pick and choose here. We talked about permissions in another episode. But I'm making these guys administrators at this level, and it's going to propagate to the children. I can say OK to that. And now, for any system inside of that data center, so for example, PLAB ESX01, somebody could go and log into that machine and log in. If they were a domain admin in Active Directory, they'd be able to log in and access it. So this really opens things up and makes it a lot easier. And also remember, you've got your global permissions. So I set this up right here on this individual server. But in your global permissions, you can set it up so that people can connect, and that would be like the whole environment, right? Not just a single place. So if I go to my, I went to Home, System Configuration, and Global Permissions. So if I want to make all of my Active Directory admins inside of my entire vSphere environment, I can do it right here. And I'll just go right back in and add them. In a small shop, you might do this. In a big shop, you probably wouldn't. In a big shop, you probably have an Active Directory group for your VMware admins, and they're the ones that you'd want to make in here, not necessarily your domain admins. But I'm doing domain admins because they already exist. Makes it a little easier for me. So I'm going to come in here and find my domain admins. And now, once I add them in, I can make them administrators for my entire VMware, my entire vCenter and vSphere environment. And that'll propagate to children, and so now that's deployed. Okay. So the cool part here is that if I ever browse to the vCenter homepage, I can now log in with my Active Directory account, assuming I'm a domain admin. All right. Now there's a few other things that we'll need to see as a part of that, but for the most part, that's setting up SSO. We're now connected to the Active Directory. That was pretty easy. A lot of people hear about SSO and they start to panic, like, oh, I don't want to set up federated services and all this other stuff. And I'll agree, federated services is a stinking nightmare. This was easy. I just had to hit a radio button and a checkbox and I'm done. It's pretty simple. So getting this set up is something that the majority of people deploying vCenter do. It just makes it so much easier to have less accounts to worry about.
Don, we thank you for showing us this information here. It does look like we're coming to the end of another episode, but before we call it a day here, do you have any additional information?
I do have a bit that I want to talk about. I know I want to talk about password policies a bit, and I want to talk about how this impacts things like upgrades and stuff. So maybe we'll do a part 2 on SSO so I can just wrap up those odds and ends. What we saw here really was all you needed to know to get SSO deployed. But on the exam, they want you to know a little bit more. So I do need to cover some odds and ends to make sure that we're exam complete. So definitely check out episode 2, or part 2.
All right, yeah. Don, we appreciate you, and we appreciate you, the viewer, watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.